Good afternoon and welcome everyone to the XpoNorth Music Keynote, where this afternoon we'll be exploring the central role artists and musicians will play in driving cultural renewal and recovery, and the conditions that will be needed for them to thrive. I'm delighted to say the keynote this afternoon will be delivered by our esteemed guest, Naomi Pohl, General Secretary of the Musicians Union. And before I open the conversation with Naomi, I'll just introduce myself. My name is Ray Black. I run an artist management company here in the Highlands and Islands, which represents artists including Catherine Joseph, Mogwai and the Twilight Sad. And I'm also the specialist music advisor for XpoNorth. So let's get underway. We will have a bit of a time towards the end of the session for questions for Naomi. So anything triggered in your mind while we go through the session, please do make a note, and we'll get to those questions in due course via the Q&A box. Feel free to post them and we'll pick them up. So yeah, to kick off, welcome Naomi. I wondered, just to kick off the discussion, if you would mind introducing yourself, tell us a bit about your career, any pivotal moments, and what has led you to your current role, which is obviously a very important one in the music business. So over to you.
Great, thank you. So I'm Naomi Pohl. I'm General Secretary of the Musicians Union. I was elected on the 7th of March. So only been in the role for a couple of months now, but I've been at the union for 12 years before that. And before that, I started in the arts pretty much straight out of university. And I worked for another trade union called the Writers Guild of Great Britain. They represent screen and script writers. So that's where I started. And then we had a really close working relationship with the Musicians Union, and a role came up and I made the move into music. And I'm so passionate about music and representing musicians. It's been a fantastic place to work. And so I started off actually at the Musicians Union representing music teachers. So our members we've got over 32,000 members. 90% of them are freelance, and most of them have portfolio careers. So most of them work across multiple areas of the music industry and music education. So I started off representing music teachers. I went on to lead our collective bargaining in London with the Royal Opera House, English National Opera, English National Ballet, the West End theatres, and was responsible for all of the musical activity really in London, which was a great job. We've got 10,000 members in London, and there's a lot of employers and engagers based there. And then I moved to a national role, so covering the whole of the UK, looking at recording and broadcasting, so negotiating with the record labels, with the major broadcasters, the independent TV and film production companies, the advertising agencies, and also we collect a lot of royalties on behalf of musicians, which is perhaps not so well known as an area of work that we do, but it's important. I'll come on to the importance of royalties for our members' careers a bit later on, but that was a really interesting area to work in, representing session musicians and negotiating rates of pay for radio and TV and film. And then I moved into the senior management team at the union. So my most recent role before being elected to General Secretary was Deputy General Secretary, and I was responsible for HR. So we've got a team of about 53 people based throughout the UK. We've got a brilliant team based in Scotland, and I was managing our regional organisers. So we've got an organiser in Scotland, we've got an office in north of England, which is based in Manchester. We've got a Cardiff office in Wales. There's a Midlands office as well, which is based in Birmingham, and then we've got offices in London and a region that covers southeast of England as well. So we're really spread throughout the UK, and since the pandemic, that's been even more the case. And I feel one of my election promises as General Secretary was to make sure that we are not London-centric, and I think any of our officials who represent members and advise members could be based anywhere. So if you've got a national job, we've got a sessions official who looks after session musicians traditionally always based in London, but now he lives in Edinburgh. And it's great because I feel musicians across the whole of the UK now get access to those resources. And I want to make sure that all musicians get equal access to what we do. So yeah, I then ran to be General Secretary. There's never been a woman in the role in 130 years. So I was up against it. And actually, I'm not a musician myself. So as I've explained, I've worked in trade unions, specifically in the arts. So it's quite a niche. And I've built up a lot of experience of representing musicians. But traditionally, the General Secretary of the MU has been a musician. So I was up against it. There's a couple of challenges. It was quite a process running for election, and I've never done that before. It was fascinating. It was great to get out there and talk to members about what they wanted to see for the union going forward. And I was kind of running on a ticket of modernising the union as well. And I've got a lot of relationships that I've built up with the music industry, which I think are crucial. You know, the Musicians Union has a really important role to play within the wider music industry. And it's important that you understand every aspect of the music industry. You can't be a general secretary, in my view, that has a particular area of knowledge. You've got to make sure that you've got a really broad understanding of all of the issues that our members face. So yeah, I was elected with a good majority. I've got a good solid mandate. It's a great feeling and I'm very excited about it. So I've got a 5-year term ahead of me now.
Yeah, and I bet a full inbox when the first day that you started, because I suppose the timing of your election, you know, in the midst of the pandemic, and if we sort of look now, and I thought we could just start it. You know, we're talking about this afternoon the conditions about enabling artists and musicians to thrive, but we've just come through a period in which Brexit, which we didn't really feel until obviously the pandemic came in and Brexit came. And I want to just ask, in your view, in those recent years, as we've experienced those big impacts of Brexit and COVID, why did the conditions that were sort of that all musicians and artists worked in make them so vulnerable? Because we know, you know, artists and musicians were some of the hardest hit during this last period, and they're still feeling the effects acutely. But looking back, yeah, what's your view on that side of things?
Well, yeah, I mean, at the beginning of the pandemic, we never thought anything like this would ever happen. We've never experienced anything like this where actually all of our members were out of work overnight. So COVID brought all work in the music industry to a complete standstill. Obviously the live sector shut down, music education stopped because the schools were closed, the studios closed down initially, theatres, I mean, literally every area of work was affected, and 90% of our members, as I say, are freelance. So the portfolio career in usual times means that if you lose a gig here or an event here, then you know you've still got your bread and butter work, perhaps of music teaching, or it might be that you do some freelance orchestral work, or you might be, you know, you might have local gigs, whatever. This was just a case of all of our members' diaries completely emptying, and every single aspect of their work was just closed down. So it was completely disastrous. And because our members are freelance, it's a precarious area of work. And I suppose, you know, we've not had to face up to the reality of that to such an extent before. So yeah, everything closed down and our work really changed at the Musicians Union. So obviously we were all working from home, and we were all really focused now on advising musicians on cancellation fees, getting legal advice on what they could expect if there were cancellations, talking about force majeure, which was something that's always existed in contracts, but is very, very rarely relied upon. So force majeure is an act of God. It's something that it felt like almost mythical. It really didn't crop up very often at all, and suddenly it was something that we were having to advise on a daily basis, and also talking about contracts being frustrated. So if you're a musician as a freelancer and you've got a contract in place, and then something happens that's outside of the control of the engager, and it means that contract cannot go ahead, the work can't go ahead, you might be in a position where you don't get paid and there's no cancellation fee. So a lot of our members were thrown into really dire financial hardship, and a lot of musicians don't have savings. And so we had to quite quickly open a hardship fund for our members, and 20,000 musicians across the UK applied to industry hardship schemes in the first 3 months of the crisis. So, given that we're a membership of 32,000, you can see the kind of numbers that we were dealing with. And it was really horrific to see. We were really pleased when the government, UK government, announced the self-employed support scheme. But then we found that a lot of our members didn't qualify for that for one reason or another. And they weren't being furloughed either in most cases because they weren't employed. So something between 30 and 40% of our members never got any support from the government at all during the pandemic. So we did see areas of work that reopened. We saw music teaching moving online in a lot of cases. We saw the studios reopen, and we took part in government roundtables where we helped to put together guidance for the studios to reopen. But sessions were having to be much smaller because they were having to allow for 2 meter distancing at least. And in the early days, singing was prohibited and brass instruments weren't able to be used. So it was really, really restricted conditions. So one aspect that was perhaps unexpected was that we were, so when we were looking at our members not earning from live work in particular, royalties suddenly became really crucial. So PPL, which is the collecting society that looks after recordings and performers, and PRS for Music, which looks after songwriters and music publishing, they distribute millions of pounds of royalties each year to musicians. And suddenly our members were really waiting on those royalties to come through. It's kind of, this is their only source of income. And both PPL and PRS did a great job in trying to get royalties out really quickly, trying to make larger distributions where they were able to. And that was really important. But it also led us to consider the areas of the industry where royalties were not so forthcoming. And one area was the recorded music side of the business. So recorded music boomed during the pandemic because everyone was at home. Everyone was watching streamed TV shows and films, but also listening to streamed music at home. So the recorded music business actually did fairly well, apart from the fact that record shops were closed. So physical, I'm sure, suffered. But on the kind of online side of things, recorded music was doing really well. But there are no royalties for session musicians on streaming, and most featured artists, if they're signed to a label, get either a low royalty rate, or it might be that they're not recouped. So they've had a big advance early on in their career, and that's never recouped because it has to cover all of the costs of recording. Basically, the label keeps a note of everything spent and then holds that against the musician's royalties. So in some cases, featured artists can go 20 years without ever achieving any royalties at all on their music, even if it's really successful and popular. So this led to us starting a campaign to fix streaming, which again is maybe something I could talk about in more detail later on. But really the message was, when the live sector shuts down, we realised that that's such a major earner for our members, and actually recorded music doesn't generate the same amount of money for musicians than it really should. So that's something that we've been really heavily campaigning on, and we've had a few wins along the way. We also, during the pandemic, we had to agree some variation agreements with some of the areas of work, like the theatre side. So once the theatres started to reopen, they were facing reopening under social distancing, so potentially opening with much smaller audiences, having to account for longer breaks so that people could socially distance when they were using the bathrooms, all of those sorts of things we had to talk about. And also our members had to turn up early to test before work, and that's still ongoing in a lot of shows. So our members were actually having to turn up over an hour early for a performance, unpaid, to have a test done so that they could go into the pit and actually perform that evening. So that was a big area of focus for us during the pandemic, and something again that we've just not had to think about. So all of those terms and conditions that we usually have in place, in a lot of cases, suddenly it was all thrown up in the air because they didn't really apply, and we had to be flexible. It was the only way to try and get our members back to work. So while we have seen musicians going back to work now, the cost of living crisis is making things extremely difficult. It's compounded by all the issues that they experienced during COVID. So if you've not been working for 2 years, any savings that you might have had have disappeared, and now you're going back to work and you're finding that your rent and mortgage payments have gone up and your bills have gone up. Also a lot of problems around the cost of accommodation and fuel and travel costs, because our members who tour, obviously they're impacted by that, and it can in a lot of cases it actually makes it not worthwhile doing the gig. So we've definitely had musicians who've said to us, I actually can't afford to do this gig because I can't afford the train fare, and I can't afford the accommodation, which is tricky. And on top of that, we've got the impact of Brexit, which obviously we've referred to.
Yeah, no, I think, you've hit on some really major topics, which I think, we're going to get into in the next part of the session. But it is interesting, some of the characteristics which are still here, but in the kind of pre-pandemic world where, live income was cash flow that was quick. If you were gigging regularly, you got paid at the end of the night or maybe paid shortly after. But the royalties and streaming side of things was a very long pipeline, took a very long time, still does take a very long time. And obviously the payments were relatively low. So this is definitely the kind of territory in terms of, we're thinking about the conditions of the future. If musicians and artists don't have that cash flow. And I think pre-COVID, there was obviously an opportunity where the cash flow, if you're on a touring cycle, might actually balance out over 3 to 4 years, but that's been really disrupted. So yeah, let's move on and maybe think about, I guess, a lot of those issues that you've just highlighted, and starting to think about your views on, those issues that are problems. What changes do you think we now need to see to resolve some of them, to improve some of them, and start giving artists and musicians the opportunity again to drive that cultural renewal with new work and new performances?
Yeah, I mean, just to say that, music plays such a huge part in people's lives. And again, we've seen that particularly during the pandemic. Online gigs were quite successful in some cases, but unfortunately didn't generate the amount of money that a gig would in person. So that's challenging, and it'd be interesting to see what happens to online gigs, actually, whether they still continue or not. But I mean, one of the problems with online gigs is if you do it and people can access it from anywhere in the world, it slightly undermines the touring model, where you can actually go and do multiple gigs around the country and get paid multiple times. Anyway, so I think it's interesting to see where that goes going forward. But some of the big changes that we need to see, obviously we're going to be campaigning hard and trying to negotiate some decent pay rises for our members, because a lot of our members have faced pay freezes for the last few years, even in work where they were actually getting paid and it was going ahead. They were seeing that they weren't able to negotiate increases to their rates of pay because the sector's been in such a terrible state. And we've got to see improvements in royalties. So the fixed streaming campaign, we've been lobbying to get, we lobbied initially to get a government review of music streaming. And we had a select committee inquiry, which was absolutely fantastic. They saw so many different industry representatives. They spoke to songwriters and composers directly. They had session musicians. They had featured artists coming to give evidence to this committee in Westminster. And it resulted in a lot of brilliant recommendations, which were things that could really help to improve streaming economics and make sure that musicians and songwriters do get paid fairly from streaming. So this is an ongoing campaign for us. We're really keen to see some quick results, and it feels like we are getting there. I feel like we might get an increase in the session fee for session musicians up front, but also we've got to see that back end of royalties improve for session musicians and for featured artists. So we'll see where that goes, but we've already had a few announcements that the major labels actually have voluntarily come out and said that they're going to pay royalties after the 20-year period. So if you're somebody who's been unrecouped for 20 years, you could start to actually see royalties from your recorded music for the first time. So that's one positive improvement, but it's not enough. We want to see more of the money that goes to the record labels flowing out to featured artists and also going to the session musicians. Another key area of focus for me is how musicians are actually treated at work, because there's a real risk of musicians leaving the industry following the pandemic. And we've got to make sure that we attract people to keep coming into the music industry and also make sure that people do stay and work. And there's a lot of issues around how musicians are treated. We hear some real horror stories. I've mentioned things like accommodation. You know, if you're a musician and you're performing a gig or doing a touring show and you're finishing work really late at night, if you're not being paid very much and you don't have enough money to cover a cab home, that can cause issues around safety. And this is a particular issue for women members and for gender minorities. Might be challenging to have to get home really late at night, or you might find that you can't afford accommodation that's anywhere near the venue. So you might have quite a significant way to travel to get to your digs, which is another safety issue. So I want to start talking to engagers of musicians about these kinds of problems, because if we want to make it attractive for artists and musicians to stay in the business, then we've got to make sure that they can do the work and that they're safe and that it's decent, good quality work. This is going to be a massive challenge because we know that the sector's struggling financially, but it is something that we've got to, you know, I think employers and engagers have to take that responsibility for performers' well-being. Another area where I've been campaigning really heavily is bullying and harassment in the music industry, and in particular sexual harassment. So again, this can be a real barrier to women working in music. And unfortunately, I've heard lots of stories of young women entering the industry, having negative experiences, and then deciding that they're not going to stay in music, particularly in the live sector. And it's something that we've just got to change. We've got to make sure that it's a safe working culture, and we've got to prevent sexual harassment from happening. So a few years ago, when the Me Too movement started, and the Harvey Weinstein case was in the news, we opened a safe space service at the Musicians Union. So anyone working in the music industry, whether you're an MU member or not, can report instances of sexual harassment, so that we could get a picture of the extent of the problem, and we could start to campaign, and we could start to see where changes needed to be made. And since then, I've had hundreds of reports. And with some of the cases we've dealt with, it's difficult to get any form of actual justice in a lot of these cases, because if it's not a police matter, or if the complainant doesn't, for very understandable reasons, want to go to the police, sometimes it's very difficult when there's not an employment relationship to actually see a proper investigation take place and see any kind of meaningful outcome. But we have managed to have some successes there. And we've got, you know, the picture painted was that really bullying and harassment and sexual harassment go on in every area of the music industry, unfortunately. So you might have an impression that this is something that happens particularly in music studios, or this might be something that particularly happens at gigs and festivals, but we found it's broader than that. It's actually something that unfortunately happens in music education, schools and colleges. It's something that happens in theatre pits, on orchestral tours, backstage in all sorts of live performance areas, and in the studio. And we've certainly heard those kind of Harvey Weinstein cases where you've got somebody in a position of power able to make or break someone's career and taking advantage of that situation. So again, we've seen some improvements as a result of our campaigning work. And there's going to be an independent standards authority established, which is going to cover the whole of the UK. So it will include Scotland as well. And it's going to be a place where reports can be made, and there'll actually be a proper independent investigation. So this could be if you've got one freelancer making a complaint against another freelancer, or if you've got something that's a historical complaint, you can take those to the Independent Standards Authority, and hopefully there'll be some proper action taken. So I'm really looking forward to that being introduced. I think it's really important. It's actually going to be rolled out to the TV and film industries first. And then music will get it at a later date. So that might not be for 18 months, unfortunately, but it's a real positive development. And we're also doing some work in the industry to try and establish an industry-wide code of practice. There's a lot of brilliant support organisations out there, so we are making some progress. And that sort of leads me on to equality and diversity and inclusion as well, because we've got to make sure that coming out of the pandemic, we don't slide backwards. I mean, there's already been some publicity around the lack of diversity on festival lineups this year. And I think we've got to make sure that this is still something that we're really focused on. The Key Change Initiative has been brilliant, which is about 50-50 gender representation on panel events and at festivals and gigs. And we're still not there, unfortunately. I think we're making progress, but we're not in a position where you can say that whatever background you come from and whatever characteristics you have as a musician, that you have equal access to work in the music industry. It's just not the case. One of the big problems we've got is if the people who are doing the booking and making those decisions about who gets the opportunity, if they're all white men, then there's some unconscious bias going on there, and you do end up with more white men on lineups. So there's still a lot of problems in this area that we need to tackle, and that's going to be a key focus for me as MU General Secretary. And then we've also got to do some more work around music education. I know in Scotland it's really positive that instrumental tuition is going to be available free to primary school age children. We certainly don't have that in England, nothing like. But we've got to make sure that we still see that emerging talent and that we see diverse talent able to come through into the industry and have a sustainable career. And finally, I just want to comment on the issue of public money, because we've got a lot of problems with arts funding as well. We've just got to make sure that if organisations aren't well funded, then they can't treat musicians well and they can't pay them properly, and that's going to lead to talent leaving the industry. Or it's going to lead to a lack of diversity, because you'll only be able to work in music if you're somebody who's got private money behind you, family money behind you, and we can't have that be the case. That doesn't lead to the best British music industry. There's tons of work to be done. A lot of these issues were covered in my General Secretary manifesto, so I feel I've made a lot of promises, and I've got to keep those promises. There's a lot of areas where we could really improve, and we could really attract more musicians into the business and keep them there, which is crucial.
Well, I think, just everything you've said there, big key issues and lots of things that, the music industry was far, far from perfect pre-pandemic and pre-Brexit, mm-hmm. and all the things you've talked about, cover that. And to me, it's kind of, these issues take collective action, collective responses. Everyone has a responsibility in the industry. You talked about some wins there in terms of music education, some wins on featured artist royalties, but they're not, as you say, widespread everywhere. And I think when we get to the point when we're looking at these issues, there are lots of leaders across the music industry that have to kind of take hold of these issues and start moving forward. I'm going to move on now and kind of look a bit beyond our borders here in the UK, and think about something that obviously is in the headlines a lot recently. Globalization has enabled musicians and artists for the past 3 decades, really, as it's kind of exploded, to go around the world. And Brexit posed a threat to that, and is causing issues around that. And we also now have a kind of global economy that's in a state of flux with what we see happening every day. So I want to get your views in terms of, aside from the gloomy economic conditions, which are kind of prevalent at the moment. What do you think in terms of keeping those international trade routes and opportunities for musicians and artists to tour? Because I think, as we all know, kind of often a musician or an artist's revenue is made up of international income. So great to get your views on that.
Yeah, well, and there's a bit of an issue here. I think, again, this has come up in the fixed streaming campaign, that unfortunately a lot of organizations that use our members' works, they're based in the US, so you can end up seeing a lot of money fly out of the UK, which is not great for the UK economy. So we'd like to see more of the money actually distributed within the UK, to make sure that we're not just lining the pockets of label executives based in LA, or Silicon Valley. We've got to make sure that there's a sort of aspect here of trying to keep it local. But yeah, I think I'll just talk a bit about the impact of Brexit, because obviously that's been the big issue in terms of international trade from our perspective. And it's been such a nightmare to try and get to the bottom of what musicians need to do in order to be able to tour in Europe post-Brexit. This is a question that we have been working on for a couple of years now, and it's still difficult to get a really clear picture. So there have been multiple problems, and it feels like even now, every day, we come across a new issue that we weren't aware of previously. So one of the big problems is visas and work permits, that if you're going to be touring in Europe, you might have to get multiple work permits and visas depending on which territories you're going to be visiting, which is one thing if you're with a major agent or promoter and you've actually got the infrastructure in place and you've got the finances in order to be able to deal with that. But if you're an independent artist and you're slinging some instruments in the back of your vehicle and you're traveling into Europe and you're going to be going around multiple territories, it's a real nightmare, and it really has stopped people from touring in Europe. It's visas and work permits, in some cases we found actually a lot of territories it's not that restrictive, but the problem is that the conditions vary according to where you're going to. So it might be that in one territory you can go and stay for 90 days without a visa or a work permit, but then in the next territory you might be paying several £100s and you have to complete a lot of paperwork. We've had musicians who've posted their passport off and then not got it back in time for the tour to actually go ahead, and that's because they've been applying for visas or work permits. It's been a total nightmare, and that's just one area. I mean, we've also got the issue of carnets. So this is something that when I first joined the union, people used to talk about this as being something dreadful that happened in the past, and then lo and behold, here we are dealing with them now in 2022. So the theory of a carnet is that you list all of the equipment and instruments that you're going to be taking with you when you're touring in Europe, and everything that's listed on the carnet is something that belongs to you, and essentially you're saying, I'm not taking this to sell. It's something that belongs to me, and I'll be bringing it back with me at the end. So in the past, carnets, if somebody took a drumstick and then it got broken, they had to bring the broken drumstick back with them so that they could tick it off the carnet at the border and prove that they hadn't gone and sold it in another territory. So carnets are quite expensive. We've negotiated a discount on carnets for our members, and how much you pay depends on the value of the instruments that you have or the equipment you have and how much you're taking, and you can get them to cover you for a whole year. But it's an additional cost for our members to bear, which is difficult. There's also the issue of merchandise. So if you're going to be taking merchandise with you, there's a limit on how much you can take. You might have to fill out some paperwork again. We've had issues where recently one of our members was traveling on Eurostar, and I think was fined because they were taking an instrument and they didn't have proof of ownership with them. So I think even though they had a carnet, they were still fined because they didn't have proof of ownership. That wasn't something we were even aware was a requirement, and most of the time people aren't asked for it. So we've known with this issue all along. that unfortunately, however much we know the theory, in practice, something might crop up because you've got a particularly vociferous official at a border, or somebody's misunderstood what the regulations are. So, you know, it's a really precarious situation for our members, and it's something we're constantly working on. So what we would like to see is some form of export office or some sort of online hub where all of the information on touring post-Brexit can be gathered together by the industry, approved by government, because the government's been, the UK government has been quite reluctant to release information on touring in Europe, because essentially they say, we can give you all the information you want about working in the UK, but the information on working in Europe is not something that we can possibly advise on. It's not our area. So the industry's had to try and pool a lot of this information, and we've worked really hard. We've worked with the live sector. We've worked with UK Music, which is the umbrella body for the commercial music industry, which we belong to. And everyone's just been exchanging notes. So yeah, I think that would be really important. And I think if we do have an export office or an online hub, what we should be looking at is really having international touring guidance available. So it shouldn't just be focused on Europe. There's been lots of problems with the US in the past. And, you know, post-Brexit, the government's negotiating trade agreements with many different territories. And what we really want is a situation where it's easy for our members to tour anywhere in the world without too much admin and without too many charges. So touring and freedom of movement are kind of the key issues for us. But there's also the issues of copyright and royalties. So again, with the music streaming issue, this has become quite an international movement. So there's been protests by artists in the US against Spotify. There's been, as a result of the copyright directive, which was a piece of legislation passed in the EU, which we really lobbied hard for because we knew it was going to deliver a lot of benefits for musicians in the UK. Unfortunately, after Brexit, we didn't get the copyright directive here. So we've not had the benefit of it. But we can see now in Europe that the situation, like contracts are improving, transparency around royalty payments are improving, better royalty payments. So in France, they've just recently announced that there's going to be better royalty payments for musicians from streaming. And that's something that was negotiated by the unions there and the record labels. So where we see international developments like that, we're quick to get on it and see, right, what have they done? How have they achieved it? What's it going to work out as in terms of actual money in musicians' pockets? And then we're trying to find ways to replicate it in the UK. So yeah, I think we've got to think internationally. You know, a lot of these organizations that are using our members' works, as I say, they're international companies. So, you know, it's difficult sometimes to come up with a UK solution for a problem, because if we're trying to negotiate with the labels here, well, they're all US owned. So they have to then go back and they have to talk to the heads of the labels based in the States and try and get things agreed at that end, which might not be easy. So yeah, you can't always just come up with a UK based solution. But what we want is to find the best practice elsewhere in the world and then try and replicate it in the UK.
Yeah, well, I think that's the thing, isn't it? For the music industry is, on the face of it, looks quite simple sometimes, you know, recording gigs, but it's hugely complicated when you start to look at the pipelines of royalties that flow around the world and the different organizations that are involved in making that happen. And I think that's the thing, we're in a kind of era now, which is a good era, which is about more transparency and hearing from those artists and musicians who are right at the end of the pipe. They're the last, you know, piece of the puzzle to get the royalty check through the door. And you know, those initiatives that you're talking about overseas, I think we have, you know, lots to learn from those, and also start to think about driving that collaborative working here in the UK, because, you know, many of the organizations that have an interest in music in the UK, when they come together, they start to have a very powerful voice, and obviously at the front of that are musicians and artists often. So So I'm not seeing any questions at this stage. So if anybody does have any, please pop them in the Q&A box on the Zoom, and I'll pick them up. But I sort of had one that sort of picked up as you were kind of talking earlier about your kind of previous work in another union and kind of beyond, I suppose, music. Do you see in other creative industries, and you mentioned a few things in film too, successes in other industries that could actually help some of these issues that the music industry grapples with? Because quite often we're trying to reinvent the wheel, but we see others, as you've just been mentioning, kind of overseas on initiatives. So is there anything kind of you've seen in even the last 2 or 3 years with colleagues in other sectors that you've been impressed by and you thought, well, we need to pick this up and run with it in music?
Well, I think we've probably worked cross industry, in the creative industries. We've worked more closely together during the last few years, because during the pandemic, there were all these government roundtables involving different representatives of different industries. And for example, when we were looking at how we get the live music sector back up and running, I spoke to somebody who was representing cinemas, so that we could have a discussion about what they were planning to do, because there's no point in reinventing the wheel in a way. It was kind of, right, what we're trying to do is get masses of people back into indoor spaces that don't have great ventilation. And, how are you going to do it if you're socially distancing? What ticketing system are you going to use? How many rows are you going to take out of your cinema in order to ensure that people are 2 meters apart or whatever? So, that kind of thing's been really helpful, I think. And we've seen a lot of similar impacts, like box office being down across, film, as well as in theatre, as well as for the orchestras, as well as in gigging. So, all those kind of issues. And again, with the technology as well, once you see how live events can work online in one area, again, you can replicate those in another area. So so we've done quite a lot of joined up thinking, I would say. In terms of, again, a lot of the similar issues across the creative industry. So the bullying and harassment issue is something that we've been dealing with across different creative industries. And so, I suppose we did learn a bit from the Harvey Weinstein case and the Kevin Spacey case, which was theatre based. You get to share a bit of the expertise that's come from those cases being dealt with in other industries before we dealt with anything like it in music. I don't know if I could say that I've discovered brilliant practice in other areas of the creative industries that I'd like to replicate. But what I would say is that we're so similar. We've got so much in common, and the bullying and harassment issues also included fashion. So, the way that models are treated is very similar to the way that some featured artists are treated. It's like you're the product. So it's almost dehumanizing. At the end of the day, your well-being doesn't come first. Sometimes what they want is to just get you out on stage at all costs. And I think, the same, certainly is applied in fashion as well. So those kind of issues, we're trying to tackle them together, which is great. It's good that we're able to be joined up like that.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a sort of theme, and some other sessions in XpoNorth I've covered as well that I've been on, where the idea that, the creative industries and the innovation that happens in creative industries also often starts with an individual, and it's often micro businesses or small groups of people coming together, but they don't have access to the sort of support you'll get if you are at a big employer, in terms of mental health support, the issues that you're talking about there in terms of HR policies and all these different things. And it does sort of feel that, the idea that the sort of common threads of these things are important to keep people working, to keep people safe, to keep people healthy. There's going to be much more kind of collective work on that, and hopefully kind of collective support coming forward, because, yourselves, help musicians, other charities out there that that do fantastic work sort of become the de facto places for people to go to get that support when they're kind of working individually.
Yeah, I mean, another great one is Music Support. They're a brilliant organisation, and they're specialists in kind of alcohol and drug dependency issues, which is something that, again, it's obviously been something that's been there in the music industry, but there's never really been that specialist support, and now we have it, which is excellent. Also, the major labels now actually have artist welfare teams, which is new and really positive. So yeah, it feels like the industry sometimes is a bit slow to catch up on some of this stuff, but we've been talking about mental health in the music industry for the last few years, and now you can see some positive changes, and obviously during the pandemic that was a particular issue for a lot of people, regardless of what industry they were working in, being isolated, not being able to work in the usual way, and it's really challenging.
Absolutely, and for those that have joined us and for anybody kind of watching after the fact, there is an XpoNorth panel on mental health in the music business. We've got speakers from Music Support and help musicians on that, so that'll be available to view afterwards if anybody wants to do that. I think we're coming towards the end of the session. I'd just like to say a huge thanks to you, Naomi, for taking the time this afternoon and sharing your insights. It's been fantastic to hear from you, and good luck with the inbox and getting through a lot of those big ticket items. And thank you for joining us in the audience today. I hope you've had a great XpoNorth conference, and take care and goodbye.